Alan Evans has proved to be a manipulative character. While nothing can bring back their daughter, we hope that they can take some small measure of comfort in the knowledge that Evans did not get away with it and has paid a heavy price for his crime.
Imagine coming downstairs one morning to find your wife dead at the bottom of the staircase and telling everyone, the paramedics, the police, your own children, that she simply tripped. Now imagine that before you made that call, you had already walked around the house placing a skipping rope near her body and uncoiling a vacuum cleaner hose at the top of the stairs, small, deliberate props, arranged to make a beating look like an accident. That's not a hypothetical. That's what a jury in Worcester, England, concluded a man named Alan Evans actually did to his wife, Louise, in their own home, after she found out he'd been having an affair with a teaching assistant from their children's school. 46 separate injuries, a broken eye socket, and a staircase that, according to the pathologist who examined her, had absolutely nothing to do with how she actually died. Hit subscribe right now, because the way this cover-up falls apart over the course of the trial is honestly one of the more satisfying unravelings I've covered. Drop a like too, it really does help. And in the comments, let me know where you're watching this from, whatever city or country you're comfortable sharing, because I'm building a list to find cases close to home for a lot of you and turn those into upcoming videos. Now let's get into it. This is the story of Alan Evans, his wife Louise, a staircase in Kidderminster, and a secret SIM card that ended up mattering a lot more than he probably ever imagined it would. Alan Evans was 35, a welder by trade, married to Louise Evans, 32, who worked as a care assistant. They'd been together 18 years and had 3 young daughters together. On paper, that's a long marriage, the kind that's supposed to have weathered whatever early turbulence young couples go through and settled into something stable. That stability, it would later become clear, was almost entirely surface level. Sometime around March of 2012, Alan began an affair with a woman named Amanda Chadwick, 30 years old, who worked as a teaching assistant at the school his own children attended. What followed over the next 4 months wasn't a quiet, occasional thing. It was constant. Between March and July of that year, phone records showed Alan sent Chadwick something in the neighborhood of 6,700 text messages, and she sent back roughly 5,300 in return. Sit with that volume for a second. That's not 2 people sneaking the occasional message past their partners. That's a second full relationship, running in parallel to a marriage, at a pace most people don't even maintain with someone they're not hiding anything from. They met at budget hotels. They met at each other's homes, timed carefully around when their respective partners were at work. Eventually, Louise grew suspicious enough to confront Amanda Chadwick directly, and when she did, the fallout wasn't quiet either. Chadwick, testifying later in court, was made to read aloud a text she'd sent Alan describing Louise as furious and threatening to go to the school and get Chadwick fired over the affair. It's an uncomfortable moment to picture, a courtroom forcing the other woman to read her own bitter words back out loud, words written about the wife who was, by the time the trial happened, already dead. Under that pressure, Alan officially ended things with Chadwick by text message. On the surface, that looks like a resolution, a marriage saved, a mistake ended before it went any further. Except it wasn't real. Just 2 days before Louise was killed, Alan told Amanda Chadwick he was going to buy a secret SIM card, specifically so the 2 of them could keep contact with each other private going forward, away from Louise's eyes entirely. Whatever ending he'd staged for his wife's benefit, behind the scenes, he had no intention of actually letting it end. Think about what that timing actually means. Louise had just confronted the other woman directly. She'd threatened consequences at the school where Chadwick worked. In any household, that kind of confrontation is a genuine turning point, the moment where a spouse either commits fully to repairing the marriage or accepts that it's over. Alan, according to everything that came out in court, appeared to do neither. Instead, within 48 hours of that confrontation reaching its peak, He was quietly arranging a way to keep the affair alive without his wife ever finding out again. That's not the behavior of a man weighing reconciliation. That's the behavior of a man managing a logistics problem, treating his wife's confrontation as an obstacle to root around rather than a crisis to resolve honestly one way or the other. That secret SIM card would go on to become one of the most damaging single pieces of evidence in the entire trial, precisely because of how directly it undercut his own courtroom testimony. It's a small object, cheap, easily replaceable, the kind of thing that costs almost nothing and takes minutes to set up. And yet it ended up functioning almost like a signed confession about his real intentions in those final days. Because there's no version of the affair was already over that survives a defendant secretly arranging new, private contact with his mistress 2 days before his wife was killed. Then came the night in July of 2012 that would eventually put him in a courtroom. Louise Evans was found dead at the bottom of the staircase in their Kidderminster home. Alan's account, at least initially, was simple. He said he'd fallen asleep on the couch, woken up, and discovered that Louise had tragically tripped and fallen down the stairs. To support that story, and this is the detail that tends to stop people cold whenever they hear it, he'd placed a skipping rope near her body at the bottom of the stairs, and left a vacuum cleaner hose uncoiled at the top, small physical props designed to explain, at a glance, exactly how an accidental trip might have happened. It didn't hold up. A neighbor testified to hearing Louise scream in shock and fear, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps moving through the house, more than 2 hours before Alan ever actually called emergency services. 2 hours is an enormous window of time to sit on if your wife has genuinely just had a tragic accident right in front of you. It's a far more believable window if you're using that time to clean yourself up, rearrange a crime scene, and carefully decide which household objects might sell a fall down the stairs. The medical evidence made the accident story essentially impossible to defend. Louise had 46 distinct injuries across her body, including a broken eye socket and extensive bruising across her face, the kind of injury pattern pathologists don't typically associate with a single fall down a flight of stairs. Forensic evidence went even further, indicating that after she fell or was pushed, she had also been smothered. Whatever happened on that staircase, it wasn't one accidental misstep. It was a beating, followed by suffocation, followed by hours of staging before anyone outside that house was told a single word about it. When the case reached Worcester Crown Court, Alan Evans took the stand and maintained his innocence completely. He told the jury he had loved his wife with everything he had, and that in 18 years together, he had never once laid a hand on her. He described the night of her death as an ordinary, even happy one, saying they'd watched television together, shared a cuddle on the couch, and that whatever had happened with Amanda Chadwick was firmly in the past by then. He told the jury they'd been planning a holiday to Spain, that they'd even talked about someday opening a bed and breakfast together, the kind of shared future people don't usually invent for a relationship they're actively trying to destroy. He argued that the entire prosecution case was built on nothing more than prejudice against him for having had an affair, and insisted that his wife's injuries were, in his words, consistent with a fall down the stairs. The jury didn't buy it. They deliberated for less than 5 hours before returning a guilty verdict for murder. Alan Evans was sentenced to life in prison, with a minimum term of 17 years before he'd even be eligible for parole. What happened after the murder, though, is arguably the detail that generated the most outrage once it became public. Just 3 months after Louise's death, while her body was, as her own mother would later put it, still in the mortuary, Alan resumed his relationship with Amanda Chadwick. The two of them stayed together, openly this time, with no wife left to hide it from, all the way up until Alan's arrest in February of 2013. Louise's mother, Judy Bollin, gave a victim impact statement that captured the raw, specific horror of that timeline better than almost anything else in the case. She spoke about the impossible task of explaining to 3 little girls that their father had murdered their mother, and about the particular cruelty of watching him move on with the woman connected to Louise's death before Louise had even been laid to rest. It's the kind of grief that doesn't really have a category. It's not just mourning a death. It's mourning a death and then being forced to watch the person responsible for it build a new life out of the wreckage almost immediately afterward. It's worth stepping back for a moment to think about what the 3 daughters actually lived through around all of this, because they're almost invisible in the courtroom record, and yet they were the ones left standing at the center of it. They lost their mother in July of 2012. For months afterward, they were presumably living in a world where their father's account, that Mum had simply had a terrible accident, was the only version of events available to them. Somewhere in that same stretch of time, without their knowledge, their father was already back in contact with the woman whose affair had helped tear the household apart in the first place. And then, within a year, that same father was arrested, tried, and convicted of murdering their mother, in a courtroom that spent days publicly dissecting the affair, the texts, the secret SIM card, and the exact mechanics of how she died. There's no version of childhood built to absorb that sequence of events, and it's part of why cases like this tend to leave a kind of damage that extends well past the sentencing itself. The community around the Evans family in Kidderminster was also left to reconcile 2 very different pictures of Alan once the trial made headlines. To coworkers and casual acquaintances, by most accounts, he'd simply been an ordinary tradesman, a welder, a father of 3, someone whose home life wouldn't have drawn a second glance from the outside. The picture that emerged in court, of thousands of secret messages, budget hotel meetings arranged around work schedules, and a wife confronting a mistress at her own children's school, was the kind of contrast that tends to unsettle an entire neighborhood, not just because of what it revealed about Alan specifically, but because of how easily that entire second life had apparently been hidden from everyone around it for months. Technical analysis. What makes this case such a clear teaching example from an investigative standpoint is the way staged crime scenes tend to fail, not because the staging itself is obviously fake, but because it's built to answer only one narrow question: how did the body end up at the bottom of the stairs? While completely ignoring everything else a forensic examination is capable of revealing. A skipping rope and an uncoiled vacuum hose can suggest a plausible trip. They can't explain 46 separate injuries. They can't explain a broken eye socket, and they absolutely cannot explain evidence of smothering after the supposed fall. Staged scenes are almost always built around the single most visible piece of evidence, the position of the body, while the physical evidence surrounding that body tends to tell a much more complete and much less forgiving story. The second technical thread is the timeline gap itself, and how damaging a delay of just 2 hours can be in a case like this. A neighbor's account of hearing a scream followed by heavy movement, set against the actual time, Alan placed his call to emergency services, created a window that had no innocent explanation once the injuries were factored in. In cases involving staged accidents, investigators are trained to treat the gap between the incident and the emergency call as its own independent piece of evidence, because genuine accidents tend to produce fast, panicked calls for help, while staged ones tend to produce delayed calls, made only once the scene has already been arranged to match whatever story is about to be told. The third thread is digital evidence, specifically the sheer volume of text messages between Alan and Amanda Chadwick, and what that volume ended up proving in court. Over 6,000 messages sent in one direction and over 5,000 in the other, across just 4 months, didn't just establish that an affair existed. It established the depth, the intensity, and the ongoing nature of that relationship in a way witness testimony alone never could have. And the detail about the secret SIM card, arranged only 2 days before the murder, became particularly damaging precisely because it directly contradicted Alan's own courtroom claim that the affair had already ended before Louise died. Digital records don't forget, and they don't get reshaped by a defendant's later testimony, the way memory sometimes does. The fourth thread is what prosecutors sometimes refer to as post-offense conduct, meaning behavior that happens after a crime that, while not direct proof of the crime itself, still speaks to a person's state of mind and priorities. Resuming a relationship with the other woman just 3 months after his wife's death, while she was still in the mortuary, wasn't something prosecutors needed to prove the murder itself, but it was the kind of detail that shapes how a jury interprets everything else they've already heard. It's difficult to hold on to a narrative of grief-stricken innocence once a jury learns exactly how quickly that grief gave way to exactly the relationship the victim had discovered and confronted before she died. Psychological analysis. At the center of this case is a pattern that shows up again and again in domestic homicides connected to discovered infidelity. The collision between a public narrative of a stable, loving marriage and a private reality that had already fundamentally ended, at least on one side, well before the violence itself occurred. Alan Evans' courtroom testimony leaned heavily on the language of an intact partnership, a holiday being planned, a shared dream of a bed and breakfast, a wife he loved with everything he had. Every one of those details was directly contradicted by his own actions in the days immediately surrounding her death, arranging a secret SIM card 2 days before the murder, resuming the affair within months afterward. That gap between the story told in court and the behavior documented outside it is less about simple lying and more about a specific kind of self-justification that tends to appear in these cases, where a person constructs a version of events in which they were still the loving spouse, even while every documented action says otherwise. The second layer worth examining is what the confrontation itself likely represented to Alan in the days leading up to Louise's death. Louise hadn't just discovered the affair quietly and grieved it privately. She'd confronted Amanda Chadwick directly, threatened to go to the school, threatened Chadwick's job. From Alan's perspective, that confrontation didn't just threaten his marriage, it threatened to collapse both relationships and both areas of his life simultaneously, professionally adjacent, socially embedded, all at once. Investigators and psychologists who study these cases often point to exactly this kind of compounding exposure, where a person facing the total unraveling of a carefully maintained double life responds not with honesty or separation, but with an escalation toward controlling the situation by whatever means feel available. In the most extreme cases, violence aimed at eliminating the person capable of exposing everything. The third layer is the staging itself, and what the specific choice to fabricate an accident, rather than any other kind of story, suggests about the mindset behind it. Staging a scene requires a level of composure that stands in stark contrast to the violence that apparently preceded it. 46 injuries and evidence of smothering point toward a prolonged, brutal episode. Placing a skipping rope and a vacuum hose with enough care to make them look incidental points toward someone who, immediately afterward, was capable of shifting into a calm, calculating mode focused entirely on self-preservation. That shift from extreme violence to methodical staging within the same short window of time is one of the details that tends to disturb people most about cases like this one. Not the violence alone, and not the deception alone, but how quickly and completely one gave way to the other. Finally, there's the aftermath, and what it reveals about how little the confrontation, the death, or the arrest that eventually followed seemed to alter Alan's actual priorities. He didn't distance himself from Amanda Chadwick out of grief, guilt, or self-reflection once Louise was gone. He returned to her within months and stayed with her until the moment police finally arrested him. For Louise's family, and for the 3 daughters left to grow up without their mother and eventually learn exactly what their father had done to her, that timeline wasn't an abstract detail buried in a police report. It was the clearest possible evidence of what had actually been true the whole time, that the marriage Alan described so warmly on the witness stand had already been over, in every way that mattered, long before Louise Evans ever set foot on that staircase. There's also something worth saying about why this particular case tends to stick with people longer than a lot of domestic homicides do, and it isn't just the staging, or the affair, or even the 46 injuries. It's the sheer ordinariness of the setting it happened in. Kidderminster isn't a place associated with headline crime. Quiet suburban streets and small English towns like it are built around exactly the kind of unremarkable routine that Alan and Louise Evans appeared from the outside to be living. A welder, a care assistant, 3 daughters, 18 years of marriage. Nothing about that description prepares anyone for a staircase staged with a skipping rope and a vacuum hose, which is precisely why cases like this one continue to unsettle people well after the verdict. They're a reminder that the most ordinary-looking households are not automatically the safest ones, and that the version of a marriage presented to neighbors, co-workers, and even a courtroom can diverge completely from what was actually happening behind a closed front door. 17 years is the minimum Alan Evans will now serve before he's even considered for release, which means the 3 daughters who lost their mother on that staircase will very likely be grown women, with children and lives of their own, before he's anywhere near eligible to walk free again. Whatever version of events he continues to tell himself in the meantime, the physical evidence, the timeline, the messages, and a jury that took less than 5 hours to see through all of it already settled the only question that ultimately mattered. It's also worth thinking, for a moment, about Amanda Chadwick's position in all of this, because she occupies a strange space in the aftermath of a case like this one. She wasn't charged with any crime. There's no suggestion anywhere in the record that she knew what Alan had done, or helped plan it, or even suspected it before it happened. And yet her name is permanently attached to the case anyway, her texts read aloud in open court, her 4-month relationship with Alan dissected in front of a jury, and eventually, the public. She resumed a relationship with a man just months after his wife's death, apparently without knowing, at least not yet, that he was the one responsible for it. When the arrest finally came in February of 2013, whatever she believed about the man she'd been seeing collapsed all at once, publicly, alongside everyone else's understanding of him. There's a broader pattern here too, one that shows up across a lot of cases like this, involving the specific danger point that a confirmed affair, once discovered, actually represents inside a marriage. It's a common assumption that infidelity, once exposed, simply leads to a breakup, a divorce, an ending messy but non-violent. In the vast majority of cases, that's exactly what happens. But investigators who study intimate partner violence consistently point to exactly this moment, the period immediately following a confrontation over an affair, as one of the highest-risk windows in an entire relationship, precisely because it's the moment when one partner's carefully maintained double life is at the greatest risk of total, public collapse. Louise Evans didn't die because she discovered an affair. She died, according to the jury that heard every piece of evidence in that courtroom, because discovering it and confronting the woman involved made her a direct threat to the version of his life Alan had been secretly building for months, and he chose to eliminate that threat rather than face its consequences honestly. That's ultimately what separates a case like this one from a simple story about infidelity gone wrong. Affairs end marriages every single day without anyone getting hurt. What turned this into a murder wasn't the existence of the affair itself. It was Alan's apparent unwillingness to accept any outcome that involved losing control of the narrative, whether that meant losing his wife's trust, his mistress, his reputation at his children's school, or the version of himself he later performed so convincingly on the witness stand. When Louise confronted Amanda Chadwick and threatened to expose everything, she wasn't just threatening an affair. In Alan's mind, according to the case prosecutors built, she was threatening to take away the one thing he seemed determined to protect above everything else, the ability to keep living exactly the life he wanted, on exactly his own terms, regardless of who around him actually knew the truth.